Welcome to the Dirt on the Past,
the Museum Edition,
a YouTube and podcast program of the Extreme History Project, which explores ancient and historical topics relating to artifact collections from the Museum of the Rockies right here in Bozeman, Montana.
At Extreme History, we explore the good, the bad, and the ugly about our human past because, let's face it, history isn't pretty. But it's so important to know because it's at the very thing that has led us to the most critical concerns in the present.
So join me, Nancy Mahoney,
and me, Crystal Alegria,
as we talk to archaeologists and historians who have been digging in the dirt
and in the archives
and in museum collections to uncover fascinating histories that are relevant to today's issues
and can help us move forward with a deeper understanding of the past.
Welcome to this week's edition of the show. I'm Nancy.
And I'm Crystal.
And we are the co-hosts of The Dirt on the Past. We are again in the Awaken studio in the Museum of the Rockies, the digital learning studio, and we are doing our podcast here with our video portion as well. And today we're going to be joined via Zoom with Sally Thompson, Dr. Sally Thompson, who is an anthropologist and an archaeologist, and she's worked all over Montana. And today we're going to be discussing her newest book, which is published by Far Country Press. It's called Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, 23 Unexpected Stories to talk, unexpected stories that awaken Montana's past. And I think that's just such a fascinating title. And I think it's a really apt title for this book. I'm interested to sort of ask you even how you came up with that. But I loved in your preface, Sally, how you talked about just what brought you to this book. So we'll get to that in a minute, but we just want to say welcome. And we're so glad you could be here.
Thank you. It's a real delight for me to be here. Love your program and glad to be part of it.
Wonderful.
Thanks.
Wonderful. Well, welcome, Sally. We're so glad you're here today. We've followed your career, and you that we'll talk about a little bit more as we go forward. But we really revere what you do and how you do it. So, we'll talk more about that as we go. But welcome.
So, Sally, we start off by telling our listeners and our viewers a little bit about our guests. So I'm going to go ahead and read a brief bio. Anthropologist Sally Thompson's long career in the Rocky Mountains and American Southwest have spanned more than 4 decades. She received her PhD at the University of Colorado in 1980, the same year that she moved to Missoula. She has worked as an archaeologist, an ethnohistorian, and tribal consultant and collaborator, and also a filmmaker. So that's handy for you.
Yes.
She has published a monograph and numerous articles in professional journals, as well as in more popular magazines such as Montana Magazine, the Magazine of Western History, and her 2015 book, People Before the Park, published by Montana Historical Society, was a collaboration with the Kootenai Cultural Committee and the Kootenai Traditionalist Association of the Blackfeet Tribe. So that's quite an impressive short summary of your bio. Thanks, Sally.
And we'd like to follow that up by talking about what brought you to the career that you're in currently. So can you just tell us, Sally, a little bit about what brought you to archaeology and to anthropology and really to ethnography as well? And, what piqued your interest early on to lead you down this career path?
Well, good prompt about early on, because my first memory that was an interest along these lines, I was either 3 or 4 years old. And we spent time at a cabin in the summer on the South Platte River in Colorado. And the cabin occupied a large meadow that also had an archaeological site in it. And our elderly friend that owned the cabin was an avocational archaeologist. I learned those things later, right? She was just a really quirky, unique woman in the 1950s who wore overalls. She was highly educated, played in a cello trio, but she wore overalls almost every day. And I think she dressed up to go play with her trio at the Brown Palace Hotel in Denver on Sunday afternoons. But she assisted a professor at the University of Denver. She and her husband, who had passed by the time we met her. But anyway, she would invite us to the cabin, and I just remember standing in the meadow with her, and her picking up flakes and showing them to me and pointing out how I would see them and telling me about the people that used to live there. So it was pretty primal, pivotal experience for me because although it wasn't like a straight line trajectory from there to grad school, it was always part of me. So got to college, had a fabulous first professor in archaeology, Jim Judge, that you probably know
Oh,
of.
wow, Jim Judge. Yeah.
And so, it was off to the races. I wasn't turning back after that. But I was very interested in archaeology, more than ethnography at the time. Remember in applying for grad schools and thinking about this, Jim had at the time moved to UNM, and their archaeology program was incredibly competitive. And I knew if I applied in ethnography, I could get in. Wasn't sure I could in archaeology. I ended up going to the University of Colorado, but at the time, I thought it would be better to mess with the remains of people rather than what kind of impacts ethnographers had on human cultures, on living cultures. So it's ironic that in a way that I shifted to the opposite through, a kind of funny process that was maybe unique to me. But I think in our that era, archaeologists were being confronted with damage that we might be causing, and certainly ignorance of what we were doing. And it was pointed out to me that the work I did was offensive. A native friend told me that. So I shifted gears at that point, and I decided I would only use archaeology in service of the people whose remains we were investigating. So my life kind of turned around at that point. It was scary. This is my career, lots of money invested in the education, and but amazingly, things really picked up for me in that realm at that time. First with water rights work in New Mexico, a number of pueblos, but mostly Taos. And that was just an incredible opportunity. And my real learning began there, I think I would say, with elders telling stories that my arrogant graduate school self, it rolled my eyes probably initially, telling stories. I was like, oh, come on, you can't have stories that go back that old. But then they would bear out archaeologically. I better think better, think again about these things that I came out of graduate school believing, like oral history is not reliable. And, I've come to believe oral history is what is reliable, and written history is what's so easily manipulated. So those kind of experiences, you can see, help shape the book. The stories I chose to work with, they kind of reveal that William Hamilton's adventure, that the Historical Society published, and then you assume it's like, of course it's true, right? Our Historical Society published it. And, the deeper I got into that story, the more I thought, whoa, this guy is just a classic storyteller.
Storyteller. Yeah, it's a good word for it. I think it's so interesting. Your career has really spanned that incredible shift in archaeology. I think for me, I can relate a lot to what you're saying. When I was going to graduate school and thinking about what I wanted to do, I found it very intimidating to think about going into the field and spending a long time with a group of people and having to ask them questions and come up with my own something to write up. And it sounded intrusive, it sounded scary. There was the language and cultural element that would also mean you were constantly a bit of an outsider, a bit, and it so doing ethnographic work. And then as archaeology really, I think archaeologists began to have those interactions more and more with Native people in the area. I also did a lot of work in the Southwest and the Four Corners area, and it began to be important and then required to do that. And that's when I think that whole education opened up and you realized, oh, why am I doing this work? And who am I doing it for? And who's it benefiting? And I found it so much more interesting to talk to living descendant communities, all around. So I very much relate to what you're saying. And I love that you have all these stories and you're very much telling your own story as you're telling all these other stories too. So that kind of brings us to our first question, which is about what inspired you to write the book. I know we've read a little bit about it, but I'd love you to describe a little bit more for our listeners, because you've had this experience in the field doing archaeology, but then also doing ethnography and other research, not only with academics anymore, but now with tribes, consultants that you would be working with. And you must have made lots of notes, jotted things down, made your own observations, and then you tell all of these, I think, in a very interesting voice, where your voice is present, but it's not a completely subjective way of telling it. So I just would love for you to talk about what inspired you to write the book the way you did.
Well, I decided to write the book after I'd worked about 8 years on another book that's coming out in December.
Oh, wow. Oh, exciting.
It is. After 10 years of nothing, I have 2 books coming out in 1 year. It's called Black Robes Enter Coyote's World. And I'd been obsessed with the Jesuits who came here in 1841 for a long time. And so I'd worked on this particular book for many, many years. And I was complaining to a friend. It had been accepted by the University of Nebraska Press. And then there was going to be a fairly long gap while they started working with it. And I was telling a friend that I could have slopped burgers and done a lot better financially than the years of, not just those 8 years of writing, really, but all the research and travel and expenses associated with it through the years. This is like throwing money out the window as you drive down the road. But yeah. She said
research isn't cheap, right?
No,
I mean, we're always like, how can we fund this? So we know that there's places to go, but get back to your story. It's so true though.
People think that you make money writing books,
Right, right.
Oh, this is ridiculous. So she said, why don't you write the stories you often tell? And it's like, there's a concept that actually could work, because I tell them all the time they should be easy to write, and they were. At least the stories I had told. But then, of course, it's like, well, what's out there now that the internet has so much more on it than when I finished the research of these different stories. And so, as you know, from reading it, all sorts of things came up. One wonderful part was connecting with people's families, because I didn't want to write about people that, that their daughter or somebody sees their story in print. So I contacted people to make sure they were comfortable with it, and if they knew anything more, and if they had photographs. And so lots came to me that way, and so much generosity. The 2 pictures of Andrew Garcia, I just love both of them, and his, I think it's his great grandson, Kelly Garcia, is my husband's barber.
Oh my gosh. Oh, that's great.
He went to some lengths to get these photographs to me to use, and people checked with their families to see if it was okay. And Diane Smith with the story about the sleeping buffalo and the boulders, the petroglyph boulders, she was a real gem, and I loved connecting with her daughter and walking through with her the story I remembered from meeting with her mom and that kind of thing. So
yeah,
it took me on a whole second layer of fun, but that the whole book from start to finish was 2 years instead of 10, which is what the other one ends up being.
Well, that's great. That's wonderful. It's so nice, and it's very accessible in that way as well, because there are 23 stories. So you can read a story and it's a few pages long, and then just dive into another story. So I love that aspect of it as well. And it is like sitting down with you and you telling a story about some experience you had in your work, in your career. So that was interesting as well.
And tell us how you picked some of the stories. I again, for our listeners who haven't read it yet, because you had many more than the 23 that you included, but you had to decide what to include. And so what drove your decision making?
Well, I'm sure you can relate, after 40 something years, my file cabinets were ridiculous because I'm an old school researcher, right? And so I thought this will give me a chance to both clean out my old records and just see what comes, to the top of the pile. So I made piles.
Oh, nice.
Sorted, resorted, and then I got rid of a lot of stuff. And then these are the stories that just kept floating to the top, and that I really paid attention to my own energy. If it touched my heart and if it made me feel more alive, I wanted to tell those stories. And otherwise, they went by the wayside.
Wow.
So that process itself was a wonderful kind of life, taking stock, what matters, what I value. It taught me, the process taught me.
And a lot of them are stories that I think would surprise a lot of folks who even know histories of Montana or more traditional histories and who want to know more. I think they're the kinds of stories I was thinking I love to weave them in when I'm teaching a class to students. It's the nuggets that you're not going to get, that you have to have delved a little deeper, or you're getting it from a different perspective, and it's the little unexpected twists. So I was especially excited about those stories that I didn't know.
Well, that makes me really happy. I love the idea of it being passed on to the next generation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you have, like we said, 23 stories in the book. We're not going to talk about all 23 stories, but we have to talk about a few of them because they're so interesting and fascinating. And so we've picked 3 or 4 stories we're going to talk about today. And there's so many more in the book, but these ones kind of are the ones that rose to the top for us. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about this woman. And this story was really significant to me. I never heard this story before, and it's so powerful. And you never hear stories like this. I've never heard a story like this before. So I was so drawn to it. So I want you to talk about the chapter that you call Never Give Up, the story of Marie Dorian.
Well, it is remarkable that none of us had heard of her. I just happened to be at the state park in Washington at Wallula Gap as part of the Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Project. And I'm like, it's Marie Dorian, Madame Dorian State Park. I'm like, who the heck is Madame Dorian? And back then there'd be just a tiny little reference to who she was, and mostly as the wife of somebody who accompanied the Astorians to Astoria, and a little bit more, but not much. And so I really dug into this one, asked to give a talk for a women's group up in Big Fork who had a talk once a month. And I thought, let's talk about women in history around here. And it was hard to do, other than Sacagawea, who do we know, right? And how much of that is hard to know the truth of. Anyway,
right.
I later actually was when reading, I was doing a review of a early draft of Astoria for Peter Stark. And I saw that her group, or that the Astorians, ran into the same group that Sacagawea was in on the Missouri. And this was in 2010. 2010. What? 1810.
1810.
Yeah.
Okay.
Early
So,
on. Yeah.
years after Lewis and Clark expedition was over, then she and Charbonneau are still working in that realm, or he is. And so I just, Peter just kind of doesn't, he didn't realize that she was with the group. And I just thought, man, what a story. The two of them, I wanted to do a play with just two women on the stage talking about what matters to women, because it's nowhere in terms of the 1800s in Montana, right? It's
Right. It's
hardly.
hard to, yeah. I mean, just to imagine, just to
Yeah,
put yourself
what
in their
mattered.
shoes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the way I weave myself into that story, right? I imagine from what I know ethnographically and from people today, continuing the traditions of what matters in tribal communities, and put, weaving that together as well as I could imagine it. But what fascinated me, it kind of all ties back because Lewis and Clark people know Dorians because this guy's father had been one of the boat people for Lewis and Clark. But they also know John Colter, who went right back up the river after the expedition concluded. And so everybody knows it's Colter's Run. And, this supposedly, run the gauntlet with Blackfeet captors. He gets through it, and then he races and hides in a beaver den or in the river, and then walks 200 miles. Okay, big deal. That is a big deal. Everybody knows it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, John Colter. And then you read Marie Dorian, and this is a woman who did more than that while taking care of two young children and surviving a whole winter that way,
Oof.
barely.
Right.
And then, goes on to live a good life, a successful life in the new Northwest, and has left her mark in that way. It was funny, the publisher wasn't sure she wanted the story included because it wasn't a Montana story. So, I rationalized that Montana was part of Oregon Territory at the time, Oregon
Right.
country at the time. And just that it mattered because there's so few stories about women. So she went along with it. And then I loved when I found that her grandson, Marie Dorian's grandson, is buried in the Missoula Cemetery.
Oh,
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Fantastic.
Yeah. Oh, that's amazing. Well, I watched this show called Alone, and it's on the History Channel. And it's about, they like put, 10 people out in the wilderness and they have to survive, and whoever survives the longest gets the big money. And they never survive. They
No,
never
just
they,
don't.
they
Some of
can't,
them are like, they
Yeah.
barely make it even a couple days.
they barely make it a few days. They
Yeah.
can't find food. They can't find, basically they get lonely as well, but they can't find food. And so they are all usually done within a month or two. And so when I read the story about her being in this very extreme environment, winter environment for, an entire winter, and it wasn't just by herself, like you said, it was with two very young children. I just think, oh my gosh, what an amazing woman. Of course, she probably had all this skill set that we no longer have, but still, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Really. Yeah, I loved writing that. So thanks. I'm glad you guys keyed in on her.
Yeah. Yeah. Very much one of my favorites.
Yeah, that's a story that should be told more, or
Yes.
something more should be done with it.
Yeah.
And another one is about Abraham Maslow. So that's chapter 9, Abraham Maslow's surprising summer at
Siksika.
Okay, Siksika. Is that right?
Siksika.
Siksika. Okay.
Yeah, and the reason that I wanted to talk about that is because I think so many people do know about Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right.
And so, especially within the education realm. And so to put him into this different context is so amazing. So I think it would be neat for you to talk a little bit more about that too, because a lot of your stories, you think you're going into this book to learn about history and anthropology and archaeology, but you touch all these different realms with these stories. You pull in so much. So that's why I was wanting to talk about this one as well.
Well, I want to credit the people who brought it to my attention, and that two men from the Blood Reserve, Guy and I, the part of the Blackfoot Confederacy in Canada, Narcissus Blood, dear friend who's since passed on, and Ryan Heavyhead. And they had heard about this from their Siksika relatives. And so they started doing research, and this was 15 to 20 years ago. And they even managed to interview an anthropologist that was in the same Siksika community that summer. She was 102 years old at the time.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
Narcissus said her memory was just sharp as could be. She had lost nothing. And so she had all sorts of memories about Maslow and how he was in the community that filled in a lot of gaps. So that was pretty incredible.
That's neat.
But it turns out that there was a lot of archival material from him. I mean, here he is, I think the founder of humanistic psychology, one of them, and then so well known for this theory of the hierarchy of needs. And it turns out there was a draft manuscript that he had written about that summer that just was never published. So a lot of the information I used was from that. And it turns out that when he first submitted his theory, he did credit them having spent the summer there, but the publishers took it out. So
Oh, wow.
Interesting.
that's
Wow.
Oh my gosh.
Without any credit. And I just want to say that so Narcissus and Ryan came to UM a couple of times and gave presentations about this. And one time I was there and they're talking about how this beautiful life way that was still pretty intact at that time is what allowed Maslow to understand what it takes to raise a healthy child, really. And he observed the whole, it takes a village to raise a child. That was well and good at the time. And he just briefly, he had screwed up asking questions for his own research project that made young women very uncomfortable. So the elders told him he had to change his research focus or leave. So he was put adrift. And because of that, he just became an observer for 6 weeks that summer. And he witnessed such loving, kind interactions between all the generations. And when he would ask questions about competition or who's the best this or best that, people would look at him like, what do you mean? They didn't even have a frame of reference for that. And so it just, it put him back, and he had to stop and rethink humanity and what's good about us, and instead of who has sexual dominance, which is kind of what his first topic had been, dominance through their strong sexual presence, kind of. So he went home to Brooklyn in his apartment building and asked all the neighbors if they would leave their doors open so the children could go in and out. And he realized that how healthy it was if either your parents aren't there or you don't get along with your parents, so you have options, because those kids, the whole community was family. And it really changed his life. So it's such a beautiful story and so much more meaningful, right? To know that that's what it came from.
Yeah.
It's something I don't think I put in the story I published, but there was a woman sitting next to me who was a PhD student in psychology at University of Montana. And she was from Siksika. And she said, that's how we were then. And we're now the opposite. Like all that we have lost.
That's so sad.
And then you just look at all the ways that, the dominant culture has forced them out of that beautiful way of life.
Right.
And then blames them for having, for struggling. And I just, as a little aside, but I heard a piece on NPR this morning about nature preschools, and that in some states where preschools are paid for, they're actually considering having those become part of school districts. And the irony that they realize that's how children learn best. And that's how those children, those adults in the community where Maslow spent the summer, had grown up that way. Yeah. Learning that way, learning from and with nature. And anyway, that's a powerful thing to think about. The whole irony of the story and what could be, and what still is if we look hard enough. If we get put in our place like he was,
right,
to just shut up and listen, Just observe and don't have a set opinion about anything.
And he,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting that too, I feel like that ended up being what he focused on, because probably he was much more aware of sexual energy dominance in the world he was coming from, but I'm sure he hadn't spent a lot of time looking at how children were raised and how to raise children. I think men at that time, that just wasn't what they spent time doing. So that was a completely new world, and he could really come to that with fresher eyes perhaps than if he got stuck with his own topic. And then it gelled into something really interesting, but that is such an interesting backstory that I had no idea about. Yeah.
But I also love that Ruth Benedict, the anthropologist, sent him on that quest initially because she wanted him to have other worldviews for his original thesis, which, led him to create this thing that we all use now. So I love that part of the story too, that you added in.
And then some Blackfeet researchers, I'm going to blank on her name now, I'm sorry to say, one psychologist from one of the Blackfeet tribes has written a book also about this story, but really from their point of view.
Nice. Okay. All right.
Sydney Stone Brown, I believe is her name. Sorry.
Okay. Well, that's,
she's
yeah, we can look that up and put it in the show notes too, what the name of that book is.
Good.
Yeah. What a great story. So the third one that we wanted to have you just speak to a little bit is chapter 17 in the book. And this one is what you referenced before about Andrew Garcia. And I have to say, the reason that I'm asking you to talk about this one is a little bit personal, because we do, for Extreme History Project, we do an event every year called History After Dark. And we have historical characters from Bozeman's past represented on Main Street with first person, with people portraying them in first person. And so my husband for the last few years has always portrayed Andrew Garcia. So my husband is Hispanic. And so we were trying to find someone in Bozeman's history that he could portray. And so we're like, Andrew Garcia. So Larry did a deep dive and did all this research into Andrew Garcia, and whose book is a tough trip through paradise. And so I as well have got to know a lot about Andrew Garcia because of that. And so we've gone and looked at the manuscript at the Montana Historical Society and done a lot of different things around Andrew Garcia. So when I was reading your book and saw this chapter, I'm like, Larry, look at this. And the pictures in there, I don't think those have ever been published before, right? So it was amazing to see those. So I just wanted to, that was one chapter I just wanted to talk with you a little bit more about. And can you tell us about it?
Well, it's kind of a funny chapter in a way, like I'm not sure how you would categorize it. I was doing research for the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes on the Clark Fork case and interviewing homesteaders along tributaries, trying to document their pollution period uses of the Clark Fork and its tributaries, pre mine in Butte. And in that process, I met Bus Hess, this old miner, and he was a character. He was, a really unusual and entertaining guy, but very friendly and generous with his knowledge. And, as he starts telling these stories about how he knew Andrew Garcia when he was a kid, and that his dad had the mining claim up there where the miners got killed and where Nez Perce Jones escaped from, right? I think that was part of that same story.
Yeah, yeah.
I was just intrigued. And so that what happened right there was really that was kind of the pivotal moment in the book, right? When Garcia almost gets killed because of his ridiculous actions. Whatever prompted that man to dress up and scare the miners. But, he didn't know that these people had just been killed the year before. No, it wasn't even the year before. It was months before, I think. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah.
that he
A group of people had been killed by indigenous people who were coming from,
it was,
well, too
as
much history to go into, but yeah, but a group had been killed. And so then Andrew Garcia is dressed in native dress because, of course, he's married to his wife, Inhulis. And so, who is a native woman, and he presents himself to these miners in his native dress. And they had just gone through some tragedy themselves, and so they were pretty scared of Andrew Garcia, who was a white guy but was dressed in native regalia.
So thanks for clarifying. I just assume everyone has read Tough Trip Through Paradise.
Probably a lot of people have, but maybe not everybody.
Good details there.
Yeah.
So, but then what is, so people can read that. It's an incredible document of that period. But to get this glimpse then of this continuing story that was so precious in many ways. Here's old Bus, who I learned from doing the research, was an orphan, but from the way he told the story, I thought his father was there with him. But his father had committed suicide a year or two before that, hung himself in the woods right before Christmas during the Depression. His wife had died when Bus was, of peritonitis from the birth.
Mm.
So they had a rough life, and then his memories, the way he idolized Andrew Garcia, I just loved the way it kept the story alive, right? And his memory of this upright old West man, and he just followed him around asking questions. But my favorite part was when he showed him the glyphs that were on this tree, and he asked what it meant, and Garcia explained to him, that it was some teepees down the creek, and that their people, it was a message left for where their people would find them, and apparently explained that it was those returning Nez after they'd stayed in Canada. Some of them came back, snuck back through, and that's who had killed the miners. But those people were leaving messages for each other of where to find each other. So Bus wanted to protect it, so he cut down the tree and cut that section and put it in an outhouse to save it. And instead the outhouse leaked and it was ruined. And he was so sad about it. And so he sketched it for me on a piece of paper, what the glyphs had looked like. And that's what I was going to publish in this book, his sketch.
Yeah.
And then just going through the Historical Society historical photographs, I don't know what I keyed in there, but all of a sudden there's that incredible photograph of the glyphs that Garcia had taken on that trip.
Wow.
So it brought all that full circle about how he had gone back to make sure his memories were true and to try to get a sense of perspective on where things were and how far away one thing was from another, and where they were camped relative to the miners, all that.
I thought that was so interesting too, because, a lot of people say that Andrew Garcia made up, the things that he put in A Tough Trip Through Paradise. And this really shows that, he didn't make up all of it, because he was going back to check in to make sure his memories were accurate at this place, to make sure the story was told the way it happened, so he could kind of remember it. So I thought that was really interesting too, and important and significant. So, and then this young boy met him, and now as an old man is telling you this story. And that, to me, that also shows just how short of time span it really is, because we think of Andrew Garcia living such a long time ago, but there's only so it's such just a short time, really, and only 1 or 2 degrees of separation there. So
one thing I don't think I put in the book, but Buzz's granddaughter Becky is also a bit of a historian, and she writes a blog for Phillipsburg or wish I could tell you just what it is. Anyway, she said, I told her I looked at my notes, field notes from interviewing him, and she said, so her dad was with us, but they were two kids, these cousins that were there when Garcia returned. So she had her view, and she'd grown up with these two men telling the story and retelling the story. And she said that he had told me a little bit different story. And I said, do you want me to, use your version? I didn't want to, again, I kind of figured she had more access and hers would be more valid. And she said something like, history's like that. Just tell it the way you remember. And I loved that too, because it is, again, back to oral history is more trustworthy, because as a man from Taos Pueblo told me, it's like Silent Night. You wouldn't change the words. You repeat it every year in the same verse, so you wouldn't change it. But written history, we tell it and we retell it and we change it. And so she gave me the permission to just tell it as I remembered, and that was fine with her. So I really appreciated that. And she provided those great pictures too, of Bus with his grandparents and as an older guy. So
that's so interesting. And I love that you started the book talking about the stories that the Kootenai have about where they originated, how they originated, their origin story, so to speak, and then what we know of deep time and geological time in that area. And I, in teaching anthropology classes, have used other examples from other indigenous people around the world who have stories about creatures of the sea or creatures of the water, creatures from different parts of a landscape, and often they are tied to something physical and important that happened, or maybe happens infrequently, but can be a dangerous aspect of climate or weather or something. And that there's something in probably the retelling and there's a lot of wonderful truth that's pretty obvious from reading that story. And that said, let's jump to the end of the book, where your last chapter is about sort of confessions of a naive anthropologist, as you were sort of presenting yourself in terms of getting to know members of different tribes, particularly elders, as you're working with them to do all this kind of collaboration and partnership work with Indigenous nations. So just tell us a little bit about what that experience was like for you and how it's changed from when you first started to where you are now. And I think that would be a nice way to maybe kind of end the book discussion.
Well, as I mentioned, I thought my real education began at Taos Pueblo. Mm-hmm. And that's where that line between just, I think coming out of grad school, I never believed people could stay in one place since the beginning of time, since the land could be occupied. But just maybe because all of us came from somewhere else, and my own family has moved. So, I don't have any roots in the West. My parents moved west, and so just and as a culture, those of us from Northern Europe or Europe, I think have movement has been our way, and so we don't even give a thought to the possibility that any people on this planet have stayed where they've always been. Well, thankfully now we know much better, but backtrack to the late 80s when I was doing this work, and not nearly as much was known about that. And so I had a real hard time believing, this one guy's telling me his clan's migration myth, and I go, Ray, it sounds like you're taking me back to the late Pleistocene. And he says, I think I am. Like, I just laughed, like, oh, you can't expect me to believe that. I mean, I was so naive that I was, and one thing I'll have to say is I never had anyone be rude back to me, but I can see in retrospect how rude I was to them.
That's my experience too. I think
Mine as well.
I feel badly about that. Can you talk too about what you've learned about how to build those relationships, how to approach elders, maybe building the relationships that might include giving gifts and spending time? Because I think you don't really get to the good conversations until, my experience has been, until folks know that you're not just going to be in and out, but that you're gonna really get to know them and build a relationship and not just come in and take a piece of information back that you need to finish some project you're on.
Well, you just touched on two important things, and one is um, taking the time to get to know each other. Like, how can you do anything real that matters without establishing relationship? But again, dominant culture doesn't really value that because time is money. So,
Right.
got a contract, got a deadline, we want to move quickly. And then taking something away. So before you take something away. Well, in the case of the Badger 2 medicine, I had no idea when we went in there to do traditional cultural property assessment. Even that phrase just drives me crazy.
I know. I was just thinking that too.
I know. It's just, it's like a mouthful of nothing. I know.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Especially to call it property and properties because they're so tangible, physical, material world. Anyway, yeah, had no idea how the sacred lands aspect and what that even means. We call it that. So, but if you haven't experienced, a deep relationship with a place, how do you know what they're talking about, right? So to me, it was a job. There were goals. We were going to go in and get it done, And as I write in the book, hosted a meeting at the high school gym and just, here's our handouts. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be interviewing people. It was just we were giving them information about how the process was going to go. We
Okay.
were not establishing relationship.
Right.
And then Tiny Man Heavy Runner, who was the traditional chief of the Crazy Dogs, approached the tribal business council, and said, "This is my area of authority. I'm going to take it." And they agreed because it was in traditional law. He was in charge of protecting the Badger 2 medicine area, and so he then took me by the hand, basically, and again with patience and really desperation, probably because he knew a lot depended on the report that we were going to write. And so, if he alienated me, I still had some power, right? Which again, just such an awful thing. Think of how you feel at the other end of this. You hire the Forest Service hires these naive anthropologists to come in and address something so important to a whole nation.
Yeah.
The arrogance of it, the stupidity of it. Anyway, he just kindly said, what if we just back up a little bit and you guys come back and organize a feed? You're going to provide a feast for the community, and then we'll think about what the next steps will be. So we did, and we brought our family, and we took the time to start to get to know people. And even then, it was a difficult, long journey. Just where's your translator? Who are you working with? Oh, yeah, we hadn't thought about that. You mean you'd like to speak in your own language? Oh, your elders would like to be telling stories in their own language and not have everybody else hear some of the things they needed to say. So we just, slowly did our best, but within the constraints of that legal process. And at that time, very much a material process. So to nominate the district, recognizing that spiritual values and sound and sight and clean water and all the things required to have to go to a place to seek visions or to sweat or whatever a person went there for, it was really hard to get that language to work with the language of the regulations. But I always wonder what spirits were watching over all of us at that time, because, the right people were in the decision-making places. And Gloria Flora, being the head of the Lewis and Clark Forest at the time, she got it. And it became so, as you guys know, that the Badger 2 medicine is now protected from lots and lots of work that came subsequent to our initial work. So we're just a little cog in a wheel, but for me it was huge to have that process of becoming friends and respect each other by the end. I think they appreciated that I finally realized how stupid I had been and just started listening, and I sure learned so much, and then have stayed a part of the community,
Yeah, that I think all your stories throughout the whole book really emulate that as well, and emulate that relationship building aspect of the work that you did too, because that's critical to moving forward in any way, really, in any work that you do in anthropology or archaeology or even history, is kind of that relationship building. And so, and of course they should be teaching college classes about relationship building instead of artifact analysis, in my humble opinion. But I think that that is what is in your book, and what's represented so well is how you built those relationships over time. And it's not just by going to a meeting and meeting someone for one time, and then you work on a project, and then you're done and you never see them again. You have built these relationships over many, many years, and you still have these strong relationships with these communities and with people in these communities. And that's how this work that is ethical and relevant and significant and heartfelt happens. So I think that last chapter to me was so important, but in every single chapter through this book, you really speak to that in some way. So.
Yeah, I find everything we've learned just in the course of doing our work is that once you've had that transformation experience and you get it, they want to know you as a whole person, and it's not just about this exchange of information and an in and out. You can't see it any other way. And just thinking of that book too, Keith Basso, Wisdom Sits in Places. Once you understand the land, and once you understand what relationship building is about, and how meaning is, how it is kept, and that knowledge and shared sometimes when necessary, and then how this weird system of the government and coming in. And I think the other frustrating thing I hear from the other side is that when people like you have done that work for the Forest Service, and then people move on and someone else comes in and they have to start all over again. And so it's not, you don't get to continue necessarily that relationship. And I think we just have a better understanding than I could have had earlier if you stop and listen. And now it's mostly just listening, as best we can. And I think that message comes through in your book, just aside from all the great stories. So there's a lot there for people to learn, from, which is wonderful.
Nancy, what you just said about they want to get to know you as a whole person. What better gift than somebody teaching you that? To slow down and know ourselves and those around us, our children, our family members, our community members, and just recognize. And it's kind of like what Maslow recognized when he sat with the Siksika. This is what they're doing. They're present to each other.
Yeah, it's that. It's being present in a real relationship. And then something amazing can happen. But that doesn't happen quickly or at a surface level. So it's about life as much as it's about anything else, but it's embedded in so many indigenous cultures. And I definitely think there's a modern way of life that has, in so many ways, moved away from that. Maybe not as much in small towns, but I don't know. Yeah.
they consider themselves wealthy people. They consider me poor because I only have one grandchild.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
They have
Your
full relationships.
wealth is in your
Yeah.
relationships. Exactly. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
It-
this has been, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, kind of going back to where we started with your conversation about our conversations about when you were in graduate school and learning these things. And Nancy, you were saying, yeah, that's kind of when, and we've talked about this a lot before, where you kind of, learn things by mistake. And
It's horrifying. You have
It's
these
terrible.
horrible memories of,
you're like, oh my gosh, I
you
was
just
so
cringe,
awful.
cringy.
But my one of my early teachers that I really think about often is I was doing archaeology out at First Peoples Buffalo Jump. It was called Pishkin in those days, but now it's called First Peoples Buffalo Jump, and we were doing excavations. And it was through Montana State University, and they had brought in a cultural consultant, and his name was Delvin Firemoon. And his job was to come out and sit with us each day and to talk with us and to watch what was happening and make sure that we were doing our jobs in a good way, in an important, significant way. But also, I think his job was just to kind of educate us into a lot of these systems and these ways that as we were undergraduates at that time, but these young undergraduate students, these white undergraduate students had no knowledge of anything that we were excavating or any knowledge of the cultures that we were interacting with through those artifacts. And so I credit him with being one of my most significant teachers, Delvin Firemoon. I don't know where he is now, but he was so important to my education. And actually, I stopped after that season of excavation. I stopped doing pre-contact archaeology because I decided that was not my, those were not of my, I was not a descendant of that culture, and I had really no business doing that. And so then I went into historical archaeology after that, not because of Delvin Firemoon or anything, just because I could see that, and I didn't want to continue that. So,
Yeah.
so
Absolutely.
yeah.
Compare that to my first field school with Jim Judge, which was a Shoshone and buffalo jump from the 1600s, where no Shoshones came to talk to us about the living culture that they still could have helped us understand. It was just, artifacts in the ground.
Yeah. Well, credit to Tom Roll, Dr. Tom Roll, and Dr. Jack Fisher for bringing in Delvin Firemoon to that excavation. Yeah.
And to time itself, because
Yeah.
a lot of things had elapsed between those two things, and a lot of things are much better now. I think archaeologists have learned a lot, don't you?
Oh, so much.
I do. It's changed a lot for the better. All
Yeah.
for the better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, this has been such a great conversation today, Sally. And we're so looking forward to your next book.
Coming right now. We'll be back with
We'll
you.
be back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but tell folks, we highly recommend this book, Disturbing the Sleeping Buffalo, 23 Unexpected Stories That Awaken Montana's Past. Tell people where they can find this book.
Go to your local bookstores. Far Country Press is doing a good job getting it placed all over the state. And, as a last resort, go online.
Okay, wonderful. And then, and your previous book is called Before the Park, Kootenai and the Blackfeet Before Glacier National Park. People before the park, I should say, the Kootenai and the Blackfeet before Glacier National Park. And now tell us again what your upcoming title of your book is.
Black Robes Enter Coyote's World. Chief Charlo and Father Dismet in the Rocky Mountains.
Oh,
fantastic.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
And what is the publication date for that one?
December 1.
Nice.
Yay.
Okay. Gonna make it in this year. That's exciting.
Wow.
Okay. Well, thank you so
Yeah.
much, Sally. And we're also going to thank all our listeners out there and any viewers for joining us today. And if you love this podcast, please tell a friend, make sure you subscribe so it shows up in your feed each week. And please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. It helps people find us. So thanks for listening or watching today. And we hope you can join us again to find out more about
The Dirt on the Past. Thank you so much, Sally, for joining us.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed it.
Good, good. We'll talk again soon, hopefully. So I wanted to say a big thank you to the Museum of the Rockies and Ashley Hall, who's sitting over here out of view, for the use of the studio space and all your help in getting this out to the world. Thanks also to MOR's Chelsea Hogan, and thanks to Lawson Alegria for mixing the music.
Yay.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.